From the Grand Reading Room in the Nashville Public Library, this is Just Conversations, Nashville Reads How to Be an Anti-Racist, presented by the Metro Human Relations Commission.
Well, my name is Irwin Vetnik, and I am joined today with two of my fellow commissioners on the Metro Human Relations Commission, and we're going to be speaking about Chapter 3 of Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is titled Biology. By way of background, I am an attorney. I've been working primarily in the area of employment discrimination for years. I am a past president of the Temple Congregation Abolfazli Shalom and a member of the Nashville Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. So I'm going to turn to Maryam and have her introduce herself, and then to Reverend Tucker, and he can introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Maryam Abolfazli. I'm also, like Irwin said, on the Metro Human Relations Commission. I am a social impact consultant here in Nashville, born and raised, and have worked primarily in international political and economic development.
My name is Davie Tucker Jr. I pastor Beach Creek Baptist Church here in Nashville. I also serve on the Metro Human Relations Commission. I have particular interest in criminal justice reform and systemic racism as it intersects with criminal justice reform. So to be here to have this discussion about Kendi's book and this particular chapter is very interesting to me.
So Chapter 4 deals with the topic, or it's entitled Biology, and it has a number of different components to it. It addresses the concept of microaggressions. It talks a lot about the slave trade and the history of slave trade as it relates to racism. It also talks about the fact that there's no such thing as racial ancestry. There's cultural ancestry, but not racial ancestry. And I think most significantly, it has a wonderful vignette in it in which a elementary school, Ibram Kendi, calls out his teacher for microaggressions towards a young girl of color in his classroom, in the classroom that he's attending. And I think it's a precursor to what Dr. Kendi says we are called upon to do as anti-racists. So to that extent, it offers an observation about how one is to act in the world in order to affect an anti-racist result. Let me turn to Davie and maybe offer his observations, and then Maryam about the chapter, and then we can go into the more fuller discussion.
Well, just following the way you set it up, Irwin, the discussion around the microaggressions that Kendi calls racial abuse, which I think is a better term, is something that I'm very familiar with, even down to today of being followed around stores, being asked questions that I think the answers are apparent to. So in that regard, I think he makes a great point when he ties it to our country's racial history, particularly when we look at the earlier 20th century with the rise of eugenics, that this idea has been embedded in our collective social psyche, that there are some differences biologically in different folk. And so to constantly have to deal with that, and as I said earlier, particularly as it relates to criminal justice, I think that's part of the reason why black, brown folk get treated so differently in the system, is that their value is predetermined when they show up before that system. So to be able to create a way to talk about that can possibly help some of us who are not intentionally classing folk that way, but may subconsciously automatically give over to the social movement that exists within our society to just, by default, act that way.
Yeah, I think something that stood out and made me think from what Davie was saying is the idea that he was sort of rejecting the term microaggressions because it was almost it almost trivialized what was really going on. And I think what Kendi's doing in general in this book is giving us pretty powerful words that go beyond what we've been saying to say, are you or are you not? You know, we're drawing a line. And this is not just a microaggression, this is racist abuse. And I find helpful because it seems like in our current history with the summer and everything that we're going through right now, we've got to make those decisions, and we're sort of asking of ourselves, are we or are we not? It's no longer, you know, this, he keeps making this thing about it's no longer murky. It's no longer I see no color. It's no, are you or are you not anti-racist? Do you experience racist abuse or do you not? And it makes a lot of people uncomfortable for us to switch from microaggression, which is just a microaggression that has no racial, you know, connotation to it, to suddenly racist abuse. I mean, that's up in the game, and I think that is very valuable. It's uncomfortable. It begs the question, then what is the consequence of racist abuse? Well, you know, the whole book is about anti-racist policies. Well, what's the consequence of someone crossing the road when Davie walks down the street? What's the consequence of that teacher not calling on that girl that was so eager to be called on in that chapter? For me, when you make these words, you make a call to action for consequences, and that, I think, is going to be the reckoning of all this. I feel like before the summer and before reading this, it was almost like you could say you were this or that, and it didn't mean a lot. You know what I mean? It didn't have a consequence for you, and I feel like he's kind of leading us into that direction.
And so, you know, when I read this, and I made comment about this, you know, the notion that there's no such thing as racial ancestry, there's cultural ancestry, and you know, that's something that I'm very cognizant of as a person of Jewish faith, because there are Jews who are of all hues and all flavors and all colors, and yet we have anti-Semitism and people calling Jews a race, which, you know, just doesn't make any sense. And you know, how all that's tied back to the slave trade and the justification for making racial disparities. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, that actually, that was the other big, it's not a contradiction, but it's a big point of the chapter is we are the same and we are different. As in, we are the same biologically, you know, historically, everything, we are the same. There's no difference, but we cannot act like there's no difference in our political situation in this country. We cannot act like there is no racial inequity. There is. And I think that is a nuanced thing that he's trying to put forward. Like, I'm sorry, I cannot say that we are all the same in terms of equity in this country, but I can say biologically we are all the same. You know, I think that's a really important distinction that must be clearly understood by our whole population. Essentially, those two things.
You know, and it's interesting. Seems like science came to that conclusion as we still fight to try to come to that conclusion. Just using some of the ways in which science determines sameness, we check off all those blocks, and we've checked off all those blocks for decades upon decades scientifically, but there still exists this collective social thought that there is a difference, that race does create certain advantages and disadvantages. And because, on the other hand, systemic racism is such a part of American history, that becomes the reinforcer to this thought that has no scientific support. Even as you say, Irwin, about your Jewish ancestry or cultural history, the U.S. has only had 2 Catholic presidents, no Jewish and no Muslim, and only 1 black. Right. You know, so when you think about that, how does that that plays out all throughout our society, to where I've shared with some of my fellow Jewish colleagues, and some of them have even been able to talk back, in that they're able many times, and they make the choice, and I understand, that they can present white. Mm-hmm. You know, but I don't have that luxury. Right. And I don't know if I would want that button. Because if I had that button, I don't want the temptation. I probably, there are times when I'm going to push it, you know. I show up at Wells Fargo for a mortgage, I'm probably going to push that button. I show up in court, I'm going to push that button. But I think until we collectively think around this idea of, as Kendi pushes us to say, I'm not a racist, is to be a racist, but to take that next step to say, I am an anti-racist. I act and I live in a way that first I acknowledge the existence of it, and I try to apply my agency toward anything that's antithetical to that.
Sure. Well, you know, one of the things that I have found fascinating about this book is that it is a continual revelation of self-introspection. I mean, in every chapter, I mean, Kendi is going through and analyzing various aspects of his life and determining, you know, in which ways he is functioning as a racist. And yet we have an example in this particular chapter of him as an elementary school student calling out a figure of authority. And I just wonder, you know, how he was able to develop the chutzpah to do that. Where did that come from?
You know, when I read this, I had an incident. I was raised in Cheatham Housing Project over in North Nashville, and I attended school at Buena Vista Elementary School. I had a 5th grade English teacher named Miss Whitley, who was a tall, very stern white lady. She literally hit me in the face with a ruler, and I pushed her down. And my mother and everybody came to the school, and I was going to get expelled and all of that. And it was years later that I found out that what happened was I was not aware of the gross egregiousness of her act toward me. Because even with my mother, I had to say what I did not do. You know, it was almost in a sense that you could have done something that would have warranted being smacked in the face with a ruler. Well, the way they settled that I came to find out later was during that period, I got a C for the rest of the year, but I had to work in the cafeteria because they basically covered and they convinced my mother not to charge her with assault. And I never knew any of this. And but I can relate to the story that he talks about, in that was one of the most, what I remember most is not the sting so much of the ruler, but the fact that I was hit in front of all of my peers I don't even really remember the incident of what. So I have lived that, and I've lived that in multiple ways. And as you said about what was the chutzpah that he had, I thought myself, because I just remember as the pain resonated on my face as I looked at her, I made the decision that you can't do that. Now, at that time, I didn't have the language for it. I could not tell you why, because it was totally inappropriate in all of my parents socializing. You know, you don't talk back to adults, and you definitely don't put your hands on an adult. But she did that to me, and I still carry that with me today.
Interesting.
The chutzpah. I thought about my son when I read that chapter, that section. He's mixed race and presents black, and I thought, what do I want him to do if someone does this to him, you know, or to someone around him, and how do I give him the chutzpah?
Yeah. How do you prepare young people or older people to call
if all
out?
else fails, I want him to do that disruptive thing. Now we will have to deal with what that is, and you know, mark my words, see how that goes then, right? It's going to be hard as a parent, as I'm sure it was for your mother and everything, about this is not how I raised you to touch someone and whatever, you know, but in terms of his dignity, and that's what was at stake, right? It was your dignity. I mean, why did you slap my face in front of all my friends? You know, dignity for something that didn't deserve that. So I would want him to stay whole, because these things seem to break you apart. You know, when they happen to you, they start to unravel your personhood. And I think that's what he's talking about in this book, is it starts young and it starts to break you apart, and you need to stay whole as a human. And part of that breaking apart is how we perpetuate racism in this country, systemic primarily. For people to walk around and feel not whole and not worthy. So this was an act of Davie saying, I'm worthy of not being treated this way, and as well as for him to defend that girl. And so I think it's about making sure that that dignity is there, you know, and how I treat him, how, you know, the people that love him treat him, and to let him know despite what's around, he determines that.
You know, and I think that came out in the book. I think he talked a lot about, you know, his upbringing with his parents, and what they taught him to do and how they taught him to act. And even though he goes through quite a trail you know, throughout the book, you know, certainly it is apparent that his parents had a major impact on that.
You know, and if you read the first one, Stamped from the Beginning, and now this, it's almost, I can relate so much to his upbringing, in that my own followed a similar course that bordered on assimilation. Mm-hmm. Meaning that you'll do better if you don't present so black. Now, they didn't have the language, nor did they say it like that. And it was coming from a place of wanting to protect us, but how you talk, how you dress, how you act, don't be too loud. All of these things were signals to say, get as white as you can, act as white as you can, and maybe you won't be subjected, or you won't have to deal with your blackness in a way that I've had to. Mm-hmm. And so when Kendi so articulates the idea of assimilation actually being racist, because I'm required to give up my cultural history, which includes my language, which includes my dress, which includes my own mythology. To give all that up and to accept one where I'm not even identifiable in that history or in that context, again, as Maryam was saying, is you border on living a life of nobodiness. Mm. You know, and so my parents helped me with, again, not having the language, that what I call now living from affirmation and not for it. There's some things that I have to know about myself, that I have to exert, because if not, when you show up, you get identified. Now, do you assume the assigned identity, or do you exert your own? And so I was fortunate in the way of even being raised by a single mother that, in her own way, as I've become more woke over the years, she was really on her game in sociology and even in personality development for me, that you get to self-identify, but you gotta know that there's consequences to that too. You know, the response to my self-identification may be, I need you to lay down in the middle of this street on your face, please, with your hands behind your back.
And he says that, his mother said the same thing. You can protest, but just know there's consequences to your protest. And that was it. And I think we live in a white country. That's just the bottom line, the beginning and the end of it. This is a white country, a white supremacist country. And so we choose to be ourselves, who we are, however that is, me with my stinky Iranian food and my strange name and whatever else you want to determine from me in the 80s in Nashville. And all of us with our different identities, with a dominant identity that is not ours. So when we exert and we be loud, we are ready. And we've all, I'm sure every single one of us has faced what that looks like at different ages and at different times, especially in the South. And that's the reality. And these are tools, I guess, to help us get stronger and be able to do that with less pain, maybe.
And I guess the comparison or the statement that Kendi makes, not in his chapters but elsewhere, is that what we're really searching for is a country in which we have a true salad of equal flavors and equal value, where none is controlling the other and none is trying to overcome the other. So I just wonder if you had any,
Well, we're headed toward minority majority. We are headed that way. 2040 in Nashville. Gen Z, apparently, according to Pew, is already minority majority. So, I mean, the salad will be there. It's just how will we hold on, who wants the dressing, who doesn't, like, who's holding on to
what's
power
that dressing
and how.
What's that dressing's going to taste like?
I used to think minority majority meant that we all start to have it to share power. I don't think that anymore. I think people will still, people are still holding and gripping power, regardless of whether representation and numbers are changing. So that'll be interesting.
Davie, you want to take the last closeout here?
Well, I guess even as I respond to what Maryam is saying, based on what you said, is that there are places around the world, South Africa comes to mind, that shows you just how significant resources can mitigate numbers.
Sure.
That one rich man is equal to X number of everyday citizens, as far as political power, so to say, in that even though whites may become the majority minority, there are steps being taken now to concretize this white dominance even when they enter into that. The voter suppression, the overwhelming filling of the judicial branches with conservative judges, creating certain laws that are that will require congressional action to turn them down. Because so often when we're approaching folk around what's wrong, often the excuse and the reason is to tell the individual who presents with the complaint as though they don't understand that that's the law. So the idea of saying that it's the law suddenly means that I'm explaining to you why things are the way they are. Well, the comeback for that to me is everything legal ain't right. So as we confront this, even here in Nashville, we have to be intentional. That requires that we acknowledge, even in our best days, we've got these blind spots that even though we try our best, that many times we're complicit with the status quo that continues to bifurcate people along these lines of race.
Sure. And the challenge is to call it out and call out the behavior, to change the behavior, and to hopefully having a better country and a better place for all of us to live. So I think really appreciate spending the time with you and really appreciate the opportunity to share Dr. Kendi's book.